for the rest of the students. And now I'm going to share my screen so that I can project the presentation that you are seeing now. That has just seeds and seed packets. Obviously, we're not going to work with those, but you can. But it's amazing how the seeds came about. I know we went around, we looked for them, we found them, we grew them, we propagated them, we planted them, they're germinating. But a lot is going on in order for all of that to happen, and we don't really think about all the intricate process that is going on, and from germination to the creation of the seeds. So that is what we're going to be discussing right now. We are going to be discussing seeds and the sexual propagation of plants, because this is how the plants are going to uh, generate diversity, new seedlings that are going to be different than both of the parents. So we need to start with the flower. So the flower is nothing more than the reproductive organ of the plant. All of you have seen this diagram, is what I had for you in the lab. And so when we start looking at the flower, we can look from the bottom. We have an area known as the bract. The bract is going to be very important because the flower is going to be a very fragile part of the plant. It's going to be during the bud stage, it's going to need protection. And so the bracts are going to play a very, very important role in protecting the flower during the bud stage. Later on, it may play a role in attraction, or it may just wither and go away. So sometimes you may see it and sometimes you don't. Above the bracts, you're going to have the receptacle. The receptacle is going to be the end of the stem. From there, there's going to be what is known as the petals. The petals are going to be a modified leaf. Sometimes they're going to be colorful. Sometimes they're going to just be green on one side and colorful on top. Collectively, normally there's going to be 5 or 4 sepals. Collectively, the sepals are going to be known as the calyx of the flower. So that's why you have the word here. So that is just talking about the sepals, all the sepals together. They're going to be known as the calyx of the flower. On top of the sepals, you're going to have the petals. The petals are usually going to have a function of an attractive agent, and collectively, those are going to be known as the corolla of the flower. So the petals and the sepals can also serve as a landing platform for a pollinator that we can see later on. And then we come to the important part of the plant, which is going to be the reproductive organs. The male component, or the pollen-bearing component, is going to be made of the anther and the filament. The job of the anther is to produce the pollen that will later go and pollinate the flower. So collectively, the anther and the filament is going to be known as the stamen. And I always say we're using the word male for as a general mean, but the rightful word for plants is andrecium. So that would mean male component. So I can use andrecium, I can use male, and some people understand one over the other. So if you all learn andrecium, then we can use that. So that's going to produce the pollen for pollination. And then in the middle of this drawing, we have what is referred to as, again, for a lack of a better description, the female component that is going to be made up of the stigma. The stigma, the job of the stigma is to receive the pollen. That's it. The stigma is going to be connected to the style, and the style is then going to be connected to the ovary, which is going to be a compartment that is hiding the most important component, which are going to be the ovules. So this will be the ovary of the flower. So collectively, the stigma, the style, and the ovary is going to be making what is known as the pistil or the carpel of the flower. And the rightful word is going to be the gynecium, or the female component of the flower. So those are the different parts that you should memorize. You should know their function because they do play a very, very important role in the sexual reproduction of flowers. And you see them over and over and over again. So if we look at the carpel or the ovary, it's nothing more than a compartment that is going to have the different ovules. And depending on the specific plant, sometimes you can cut the ovary into segments or into sections. Sometimes it's just going to be one with one seed, one ovule with one that becomes later a seed. And sometimes it's going to be several of them that over time may have gone fused and they generated one single item. So example for this would be the tomato that is going to have several compartments with many, many seeds. So we may have just a single ovary or a compound with several segments. Uh, and so when we look at just different examples, here we have fuchsia, and we have towards the top, we have that ovary. You can see it in a little bit of green. And then we have the sepals that are the pink. And then we have the petals that are going to be the lavender purple. And then the stamens that are going to be many here. And then the longer stigma that is going to receive the pollen. On many flowers, the stigma is going to be protruding further from the plant because when the pollinator comes and visits the flower, it needs to grab the pollen that is carrying from a different plant first before it's able to, or perhaps it may be able to self. So the purpose of the sexual reproduction of the flowers is genetic diversity. The plants wants to have pollen from a different plant so that their offspring is going to be genetically different and they might be stronger than the parents, and that's how they're going to continue on with the species. So just an example for fuchsias. Here is the passion flower. Many of you dissected this today. So a few items that are going to be unique. So we have the corona filament that is made out of those fringy parts. And then you have in the center a column, just an extension of the column that on top you're going to have the ovary with the stigma and the style, and then you're going to have also the stamens that are going to be surrounding the ovary. So that's going to be right here. So that would be the most important component. The petals and the sepals are below, and the bracts are also behind. And then if we look at a rose, the roses are going to be weird because now we can add the word hypanthium to the equation because not all flowers are going to behave the same. The hypanthium is nothing more than the bases of the petal that are going to form what is known as a floral tube. And this will become very important later on when we talk about the fruit. So keep this in mind. So when we look at a rose, the fruit or the carpel would be right inside the floral tube, and you have the stigmas that are connecting to each of those ovaries here at the bottom. So this would be the carpel, and then you have all the stamens, and then the remnants, not the remnants, but the pre-open petals right there. So this is a flower bud from a rose cut in half so that you can see. But the important thing is going to be the hypanthium for some of this because that's going to play a much, much more important role later on. And then when we look at that rose and it opens, we're going to find just 5 petals and then a lot of stamens and a lot of stigmas. So it's not just one stigma. As we saw with this previous drawing, we have many, many, many ovaries here, and each of them will have to be connected to a stigma. And so that is what we have here. We have all the different stigmas that will have to receive the pollen from the stamens. So that will be the wild rose that is going to you find in the nature and not in cultivation. So the nature of the ovary. So that compartment. So think about when we did the ferns. When we did the ferns, you went around and you collected fern leaves. Fern leaves that at the bottom, when it was time for them to reproduce, they have that sporangium or that uh, what was the name? Sporangium prothala, no, the spore bearing structure underneath the leaf. And so if you now think of the modern day plants as they evolved, it was very simple for that leaf that had the spore bearing structure to simply close. And when it closed, it kept the spores inside that later turned into the eggs. And then at some point, it developed what is known as the stigma, and that eventually became the carpel of the flower. So it was just the next logical step from the fern that they already had the spore bearing structure or the sexual structure of the fern. But instead of releasing it to the air, they kept it and protected. It is going to be the equivalent if we look at a marsupial mammal versus a placenta mammal. The placenta, like humans, we are in the womb a lot longer and we are born a lot more prepared to handle the world. We are born fully developed. And so that is exactly what is happening here. So a leaf at some point decided to close itself, and instead of releasing the spores, it kept them. And then eventually it found a way to bring the pollen, and that eventually became the fruit and the seed of the plant. So that's how they think the carpel or the different compartments became or were developed in flowers. And then here's the spore bearing structure, as I mentioned, for the ferns. So just wrap those around, close them, and you have the ovules and the compartments or the carpels for the flowers. And the most common example would be peas. If you look at peas, it's nothing more than two leaves or a leaf folded in half. And you even see where the plants have welded each other. So there is a nice area that is still has weakness, and that's where you cut the pea in half. And when you open the pea pod, it is splits into two leaves or two segments. And inside you have the seeds. And so that would be a very simple carpel, probably very primitive or just very simplistic, because it probably started like this. And as it then started getting more complex, then several of those carpels became fused together. Perhaps at one point they were separate by kind of fuse. And then as they became more complex, then they started to share one single stigma. So perhaps at one point there were several stigmas, each of them with their own carpel. Then it was one carpel with just a stigma, and then just one stigma to all the different carpels kind of fused together. So they say perhaps this is how many of those complex carpel started to kind of work together and became a much more complex unit, more complex than just the plain pea pod. And so on the left, you have what they believe is the example, just a leaf that had some kind of egg producing cells or spores, and that became closed and eventually became those ovaries and then the compartment. So that's what they believe. Again, we don't have a missing link to show us this. So that's as far as we're going to go. And so when we look at the example here, with the tomato, we have the two segments where you can see there's a fusion, and that's going to be where the line is located. And so you have the wall, and inside you have the seeds as well as the placenta. Yes, plants do have placenta, and that could be part of what is holding the seed next or attach the seed to the carpel or the fruit. So there you see the compartments of the two tomato or the tomatoes fused together and become complex. Or we have here what happens. So this very important process happens in the carpel. So this is where how the production of the egg. So it is believed that the megaspore, again, plants come from spores. So inside the ovary, there's going to be a spore or some kind of primitive spore that will multiply and create different cells. When it multiplies, only one will become the egg. and it's going to go through a process creating several things. It's going to have an egg, and then it's going to have a polar nuclei. The polar nuclei that you see in the center is going to be very important, and you'll see why. Do not worry about this antipodial that it has no more function. But the important thing is that when the process has occurred and the spore turns into an egg, the egg is going to wait for the pollen. The egg is going to be right here, and that's the entry for the pollen to occur. So cells are going to multiply. They're going to go haploid, meaning that they're going to have half the genetic material from the mom, and then the other half will be from the dad. So this exact process is going to occur for the pollen. So in the same manner, in the anthers, the pollen cells are going to start from a spore, and they're going to generate what is known as the pollen grain. So this is how the pollen will be created, several cells that will multiply, each one haploid, and then they're going to convert themselves into the pollen that will later bring about what is known as pollination. So when we look at what's going to happen, this is the first step. When the pollen reaches the stigma, that has achieved the process of pollination. The most important thing is that the pollen needs to be compatible. It needs to be from the same species. So you cannot pollinate apples with oranges. The pollen is very different. So assuming that the pollen is compatible, then chemical signals from the stigma, letting it know that it's the rightful pollen, is going to be given to the pollen, and the pollen is going to germinate. So the pollen is nothing more than a packet that is going to have several cells inside. So once the pollen germinate, the very first cell that begins to that comes out is going to have enzymes that are going to digest the stigma and the style, and they are going to tunnel their way from the stigma through the style all the way to the entrance of the ovary. So that's going to be cell number one. Behind that first cell that is going to be mining and tunneling, there's going to be two sperm cells that are going to follow. The very first cell that enters the ovary is going to fuse with the egg. Once it's fused with the egg, now the egg is going to be diploid. That's going to complete the genetic material. That will then become the embryo, the baby plant. The second sperm that enters the ovary is going to fuse with the polar nuclei, so those cells that are in the center. Once they fuse with the polar nuclei, that is going to begin to change into starch, and that is going to be the energy reserve that is going to be very important for the seeds to survive and germinate. So this is that extra step that plants have taken or have to take in order for them to have better, or seeds that are going to be better prepared for surviving for longer period of time, and also taking them away from the water that is what has kept the ferns restricted to water because of the spores and not having a true seed. So once the sperm has met up with the egg, that has then achieved what is known as fertilization. So remember, pollen reaching the stigma, that's just pollination, germinating of the pollen and tunneling to reach the ovule or the egg. Once the sperm meets the egg, that achieves fertilization, and that is going to be in the job of the flower. So flowers are produced for this to happen, for pollination and fertilization, and that's it. So this is just to summarize the fertilization. So the first sperm that meets the egg, that's going to form the zygote. That is going to be the embryo. And then the sperm that meets with the polar nuclei is going to then form what is known as the endosperm, or that starchy reserve for the seed. And so this had to happen to every single flower that you collected the fruits and the seeds from. Uh, and so this is just what eventually will happen. You have first the young ovule that is then fertilized, and that will then become the seed of the plant. And with an embryo and the endosperm that is going to be this reserve or the starch, and then the seed coat that will later be developed. And so when fertilization takes place, then the ovary of the plant will begin to swell to create the fruit that will later become very important as a dispersal agent. So to attract animals to disperse the seed and move it to a different area. And so that's then is going to happen. We have a fruit here, a simple fruit. This is obviously a cherry. And so when we look at a cherry, we have a swollen ovary, the swollen ovary that is going to become the fruit. And then we can divide the fruits into different segments. The exocarp, meaning the outside of the fruit, that's going to be the rind. The mesocarp, which is the middle of the fruit, that's going to be the flesh component of the cherry. And the endocarp, which is going to be the inside of the fruit, which is going to be the seed in this case, that has a very hard shell, and inside you have that one embryo waiting to germinate and begin to grow. And then when we look at other fruits, we have examples of dry fruits. We have examples of dry fruits such as legumes, the bean family on the top left. We have the examples of dry fruits known as silics, which are going to be the mustards, and then follicles, which are going to be the columbines. We have caryopsis or grains, which are going to be the fruits for corn and or grasses, wheat or rice. And then we have achene, which is a single seed uh, uh, fruit, which is going to be a sunflower or dandelions. We have samara, which is going to be known as a single seed with a wing, and that's going to be the fruit of maples and a few other plants. And then we have what is known as the true nuts. In our example here, we have acorns, but in this category, we also have hazelnuts, walnuts, macadamia nuts, and pecans, and that's it. Every other plant or nut that is usually referred to as nut is should be rightfully referred to as trail mix. So almonds are not nuts; they're trail mixes. So here's just a few other examples. And then you're going to have the fleshy fruit that perhaps the ovary is what begins to swell. The ovary is going to gather sugar that is going to make it tasty for animals to eat. And in the process, they'll pick up the fruit, take it somewhere, and drop the seeds, or they will ingest the fruit, seeds included, but the seeds are going to survive the digestive tract of that animal and they'll be deposited somewhere else. So we have a true berry, such as our tomato, which is a fleshy fruit with lots and lots of seeds. We have the example of a peepal, which is the fruit for the squash and melons, and that is going to be a true berry, a fleshy fruit with lots of seeds, but has a leathery rind. Then we have a pome, which is going to be a weird fruit of an apple that we'll explain later on. And then the fruit of a citrus, such as oranges, is known as a hesperidium, which is a fleshy fruit with lots of seeds, which is a berry. However, the rind is going to have a lot of oils, oil glands, and that's going to make it different. And then we have the stone fruit or a drupe that is going to be the example of our peach or our cherry. Stone fruit because they're very hard, but the rightful word for this fruit is going to be drupe. It's a single seed with a very hard shell, but only one embryo inside. So those are just examples of some of the fleshy fruits. So here's the drupe, and there's just a definition. Stony pit containing a seed. We have our peach, and then we have our almond. So the almond is a drupe. However, unlike the peach, the inside of an almond is going to be more of a woody that is soft. You can peel it. And the fleshy component of a peach is going to simply be a rind or a green rind that is going to become dry and you can peel it off. So in a peach, you eat the mesocarp, which means you eat the middle of the fruit that is fleshy. In an almond, you actually eat the seed, which is the endocarp or the inside of that fruit. And there's just a definition for that. And then also a drupe is going to be the coconut. So if you look at the coconut on the left, uh, what will constitute the fleshy component of the peach is nothing more than the husk. In the case of coconut, the husk that is going to serve as a floating device, because coconuts are going to fall to the ocean and they need to float to the next island. And so that's going to be the job. Inside, you're going to have the endosperm. Remember the polar nuclei that fused with the second sperm that became the endosperm, which is going to be the energy reserve for the baby plant. In the case of coconut, that is going to be the white meat. That's reserved for the baby plant. The coconuts are also going to have a nice container of water because the embryo needs to drink water when it's germinate. And so that is going to be known as a liquid endosperm. When the baby coconut is ready to germinate, or when any seed is ready to germinate, they are going to release enzymes that is going to change the starch into sugar, and that is what's going to trigger or give the energy for the embryo to begin to grow and for the seed to germinate. And so when the baby coconut is ready or beginning germination, it's going to send those enzymes. The liquid is going to change into this, what is known as a coconut apple. And so that is the beginning of the digestion of the liquid. And eventually the meaty component will be digested. And then eventually the baby plant will be born. Here's just example of the berries. So we have the tomato, as well as the grapes, not the seedless grapes, but the real grapes that have a lot of seeds and they have a fleshy fruit. So those are going to be examples of our true berries. And the people, just a fleshy fruit with lots of seeds, a berry with a leathery rind. The cucumbers, the squash, zucchinis, all of those members of the cucumber family have their own fruit. And here's the leathery rind for this squash or pumpkin that we have. And there are the cut section of the fruit showing you the different compartments or the different carpels. So the segments, each of them that had several ovules, and each of them became a seed after a lot of sperm went and they fertilized all of them. So that's what we have there. And then the citrus or the Hesperidium, so or the oil glands are going to be those dots that you see at the edge of the rind. So those are going to be the oil glands. Inside, fleshy fruits with lots of seeds. Obviously, we're not talking about the seedless oranges. They're each encased in their own compartments, and that's going to be the segments of the orange. And they're going to have a lot of juice. So that's going to be the Hesperidium or that unique fruit to the citrus or the citrus family. And then the rose. The rose is going to be very different. So the fruit for the rose are going to be an achene. So just like a sunflower, each of those are going to be the fruit, the white component. And you can see with this image, you have the remnants of the stigma above the fruit, and you see the remnants of the sepals. And then you have portions of the stigma still attached to each of the achenes. The ones that are big got pollinated, the other ones did not. But when we look at the fruit for roses, they are going to be known as hips. The hip of the rose is not the swollen ovary. The swollen ovary will become the achene right here. But it is that word, the hypanthium that I mentioned before, the base of the petals and the sepals, that in the case of roses is what's going to become fleshy, is what's going to become sweet or a little bit sweet, and that is going to play the attractive agent for this specific fruit. So it is kind of a vessel that is holding a bunch of fruits inside. And so you have on the left how it looks. and you have on the right a cross section with the true fruit of roses, which are going to be the achene. So inside there's going to be one seed. So that's going to be the hemp for roses, or the fruit for the roses. Which brings us to the apple, and the apple is going to be the same. So with the apple, the crispy portion that you eat is going to be the swollen base of the receptacle. The core of the apple is going to be the true ovary, but because they're kind of fused together, it is only when you cut it in half and you're able to see the dividing margin right there in the arrows. That is where the edge of the ovary is and the beginning of the swollen um, petal base, or the the hypanthium. So it's kind of weird. So in reality, when you are eating an apple, you are not really eating the fruit. The fruit, which is the core, usually gets chucked, and then hopefully the seeds will land somewhere. You're eating the receptacle, sorry, the hypanthium, the floral basis of the floral part. Again, it's weird. Apples are weird, pears are weird, but that is exactly anatomically, that is exactly what we are eating when we're eating an apple, not the actual fruit, the swollen ovary, as most of the other plants. And so if we look at anatomically, if you are eating an apple, you're eating a vegetable, not a fruit, unless you eat the core, but that's a different story. So apples are vegetables, not fruits. And we have just the achene, which is going to be a dry indehiscent. Indehiscent meaning that it doesn't split naturally. You have to crack it. And so an achene, which is a single seed fruit. So sunflower is not a seed, it's a fruit. The inside, which is what people eat, then you're eating the seed. And that's going to be a fruit for a lot of the sunflowers, including our dandelion on the top left. Those are the achenes for dandelions that have a parachute that will fly and spread them out into many, many different areas. And achene, this fruit is what you find in roses as well. So it's a single seed fruit with an outside covering. And then we have Samara for maples, which is an achene, as we saw before, with wings. So now they use the wind to propel them further from the tree and allow them to disperse. So they use the wind, not an animal, as a dispersal agent. So an achene with wings is known as a Samara. Maples would be the best example for this. And here's the fruit. So you have the wing, and then on the top left, I separated the wing from the actual achene or the actual fruit, and that's what you would plant. And the wing gets thrown away because its job is done. And then the caryopsis, which are going to be the grains. This is where the endosperm is going to be fused to the embryo, and it's just one single unit. So when you look at the wheat and even our sorghum, there is that little portion, that little dot at one end. That is the embryo. So the little dot and the little dot. But the embryo is fused to the endosperm, which is going to be very starchy. And that is what we then are going to ferment and make it into beer for barley, or that's what we're going to grind up and make it into flour for making bread and eating it. So we humans depend on the grains for most of our calories, and is what's feeding the world. So the grasses, the fruits for grasses, which are caryopsis, commonly known as grains, would be the fruit for this dry fruit. And then the nut, the true nut, as mentioned before. And at one point, maybe there were more than one embryos in the primitive or their ancestor, but as time went by, only one was able to retain, like we saw earlier in the lab with some of the stamens. So as the plants evolve, maybe they find things that are not necessary and they will abandon them with time. And so that's the case of the true nuts. We have macadamia nuts and acorn as two of our examples. And then we have dehiscent or dry fruits that are going to break open when they are mature. So here's follicle, and our example is oleander. I think also milkweed will fall under this category, that you better catch the seeds before they open and they are released. So there seems to have a weak side that will open or split when the seeds are ready to be dispersed. So this will be a follicle. And then here's columbine, so where you can see the opening of that follicle, and the seeds already gone, and that would be the ripe ovary right there. And or the legume, the beans, the bean pods, you grew some of the senas or the popcorn plants, so those are going to be all legumes, and it's a dry fruit, sometimes fleshy, but there may be more than one seed in there, and sometimes they're going to split, not always, sometimes they're going to split into individual seeds, so there are a lot of variations within them. So the fruit of a bean family, member of the bean family, that's going to be known as a legume. Peanuts will fall under this category as well. And here's just a couple more examples. Some of them fruiting form, some of them dry form, some of them have been used by people for many years, like garbanzo beans, peanuts, tamarind, and a carob tree that is also a chocolate substitute. So just the variations of the different legumes that are out there. Uh, and here's the capsule. This would be often for some of the lilies or the fortnight lilies. So you can see the different compartments, different carpels, and the seeds. You can see with the example on the left, there's one that seems to be much, much bigger. So that got better pollination and the seeds are larger. And that's why it was able to outgrow the other compartments. And you can see the different seeds when I cut in different areas. So capsule would be a different types of fruit. And then there's going to be the weird individuals like a strawberry that are going to be known as aggregate fruit. So the strawberry fruit are going to be the achene. Those are going to be the specks that you see covering all over the red portion. The red portion of the strawberry is going to be a swollen receptacle that becomes juicy and sweet as an attractive agent. But the seed and the fruit of the strawberry are going to be the achenes that are going to be covering or on top of the receptacle. Each of them had a stigma and a style attached to them when the strawberry was in the flower stage. Later on, they kind of form one unit, and that's why they're called aggregate fruit, because one flower with different stigmas that later become as a single unit, that is strawberry, is going to be an aggregate fruit. And the same thing with our raspberries. This is another aggregate fruit where you can see here the different druplets, because there is a seed with that has a hard shell. That's why they're kind of crunchy when you eat them. But here you can see the different druplets, each of them with the remnants of the stigma, which means that in order for them to be perfect, there has to be a pollen that had to land at the tip of every single stigma. And that's what we have here. And even with the blackberries, you can see the remnants of the stigma. So because they each have their own stigma, each of their own ovary, but at the end they mature into just one component, then that is referred to as an aggregate fruit for raspberry. Or we have the multiple fruit, where the example is going to be the pineapple, where you have separate flowers, each of them with their own reproductive structure, each of them separate from one another. But at the end, they will fuse into one single unit, and that is going to be the pineapple. So separate flowers fuse into one unit is going to be multiple, and that's going to be the pineapple. So if we analyze the pineapple, we have here the individual flowers, and you see the margin where each or the end of the flowers of each of the ovaries is. So there's a margin, there's a remnants of the petals and sepals and the reproductive parts. And so you have the margin right here. And you can see where the next one is, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And so when we look at analyzing it more, we have in the center of a pineapple is going to be the flower stalk. So the flowers are attached to the flower that later becomes part of the fruit. This is the center that most people cut because it's kind of fibrous and it's not as sweet. So that is the flower stalk of the pineapple. But attached to that is going to be the different compartments or the different ovaries, each one that has swollen. And you can see on the edge where they have fused together. And you have what would be the ovary or the seed, and you have the bracts, each associated with a flower. So that would be the pineapple fuse. You can kind of see where each of them are, or which of them are. So that's a weird pineapple. So those are the fruits and those are the seeds. So the process is very long, very tedious. There could be many mistakes, many problems that will occur. So when you find the seeds, it's something amazing. And pollination had to happen, fertilization had to happen, and then the maturation of the seeds until they're ready to be dispersed and or find a place to be planted. So then what happens? We're going to plant them and they're going to germinate. But this entails another gigantic process for something like this to occur. First of all, when the seeds separate from the plant, they're going to go into a dormancy, meaning they're going to go to sleep. Many of them may fall during the fall or the fall season. And so if they happen to germinate immediately, they are going to die because the winter is going to come in. It is very important for you to start looking at where does the seed come from, because sometimes you're going to have to put the seeds in the fridge to end or complete their life cycle. Sometimes you're going to have to plant them immediately if they come from the tropics where it never really they never dry out. If they dry out, they're going to die, so you need to plant them immediately. So start looking at where the origin of the seed is, because that can give you clues as to what is going to be the treatment that you need to give the seed in order for it to germinate. So be aware of that. So here's just some mustard seeds that are germinating, and I know all of your many seeds are already germinated within a week. So it doesn't take long if the right environmental factors are met for the seed to germinate. So when we look at the seed, these are a lot of words, but what you need to know is that there's going to be a seed code. The seed code for the seed is going to play a big factor. It's going to protect the seed or the embryo inside. The seed code may be very hard, which means that sometimes you might need to cut it. It's called scarified. You might need to cut it with a knife to allow water to go in. Sometimes over years, the seed is going to roll around and it's going to make crack on some rocks or sand. And so it's going to protect the seeds because it's going to be rough out there. The other thing that is going to be found in the seed is going to be the endosperm. The endosperm is going to be that energy reserve for the seed to be to use for germination. Now, depending on the seed, some seeds are going to have what is known as the cotyledon. The cotyledon, which are going to be the seedling leaves, and that is where the plant is going to store the energy, and that's going to be the case of beans. And that's what we're going to be eating when we're eating beans. We're eating the cotyledons that are loaded with energy for the embryo. And so we have the seed code, we have the endosperm or that energy, and the last thing is going to be that embryo. So inside the seed, there has to be an embryo that is needs to be viable, alive, because like everything else, many things uh, can kill a baby plant. And so an embryo that is healthy, an embryo that is alive, needs to be there. The rest of the parts for this slide, you don't really have to know them. You don't have to worry about all of that. Just know that the radicle is going to be known as the seedling root. So that is going to be the first thing that will come out. And then just those are the other parts. So seed coat, endosperm, and embryo are going to be the three most important parts of the seeds, or the ones that you should know. Here is a germinating seed. So that is that radicle or the seedling root. And what is very important for you to understand is that when the seed is finally formed and matured, a completed plant is already inside. So the baby, the embryo, is already a fully developed plant that needs to just become established. And so when you plant the seed, you always need to water, because water is going to be the triggering mechanism that is going to trigger the germination process. When the water is able to reach the inside of the seed, it's going to be drank by the embryo. And with the water, the fully formed root is simply going to elongate and stretch. It's going to rip the seed coat, and then it's going to come out of the seed and drink some more water that will continue on the germination process of the seed. So remember, it's a fully formed root. All it needs is water to elongate and begin to drink more water. So water is going to be very important component. And so we have that root that came out of the seed, and you can see the seed coat is still attached to uh, that seed. So I just pulled it out. And then what happens when the root begins to drink more water? Now there's going to be an expansion of the stem, or an elongation of the stem, eventually opening the first seedling leaves, or the cotyledon. And as time goes by and the plant is able to use more energy, then it's going to be able to produce the first true leaf that will now be able to carry out what is known as photosynthesis. So throughout the germination process, the seedling is relying on the stored energy, so that endosperm. And so if that endosperm happens to run out before the seedling is able to send out the leaves onto the sunlight, it is possible for the seedling to starve and die. If at any point when the germination becomes initiated, if the seed dries out, it's dead. So just like human babies, it is during the baby stage that is the most critical and the most sensitive time of the human lives, or seedling lives. So if they manage to get through this, they are well off, and they'll be good, and they'll grow to become big plants. So that is the germination process. And so here is the seedling leaves. So those cotyledon in this case that opened up, and as soon as they start getting more leaves, then photosynthesis will begin. And once again, the cotyledon and the stem, all of that is already formed. It's only using that water to elongate and push itself up, the roots down, and the rest of the plant begins to grow. And then eventually you're going to have the production of those true leaves, the ones that will follow the baby or the cotyledon. And once that happen, once the first leaves are made, by that time the endosperm will probably run out. By that time the seedling is already established. By this time the plant is now able to photosynthesize, and the plant is able to feed itself, and now it is no longer dependent on anything that the parent has provided. Now it has become its own individual. So that could take a couple of days, that could take a couple of weeks, depending on the plant. Then it's now an established plant, because it's no longer relying on the endosperm or the energy placed on the seedling. Yep. And so if we look at just a run up of the germination, so it is a dormant seed that needs to reactivate its metabolism, and that is going to occur by water. So that's really important. And once the activation starts, the radicle, which is going to be the seedling root, will come out first. And then the plumule is going to be the shoot. That is the actual name for the baby shoot or the stem. Requires for the embryo to be alive. And I know we've heard not too long ago about those seeds from Monsanto that abort themselves. That was bad. So because if there's no viable embryo, there's nothing that's going to grow. Uh, the embryo can be killed by insects. The embryo can be killed by heat. The embryo can be killed by assortment of many different things, as well as mutations and defects that may occur during the process. And the appropriate environmental conditions needs to be met, and that will depend on the different seeds and where they came from, and whether or not they need to go into the fridge or a cold period, or they need to be dried out, or in many cases they need to go through a fire. And I know that's a bad word right now, but there's going to be plants that the seeds needs to be burned in order for them to trigger the germination process, because it is not only the breaking of the coat by the fire, but also the chemicals in the fire that will trigger the awakening of the embryo from inside the seed. Uh, and so this is what's going to happen. So we have that seedling or the seed that is going to be planted. It's going to absorb the water. The root is going to come out. That will then begin to drink more water. That will then trigger the shoot to come out using the cotyledon or the endosperm that is in the cotyledon. And then eventually the plants become established, and the cotyledon is just going to wither away because their energy has been used, and the plant is now established. So that's, if all goes well, this is what we hope to see for every single seed that we plant. And so this is what's going to happen. So you're going to take the seed, and the seed requires a lot of water. So sometimes 3 to 4 times its own weight in water. Now, that may not seem a lot, but it is a lot of water when you really think about it. So once you water the seedling, it's going to uptake a lot of water. So it's going to drink as much water as it can, and that is what's going to trigger the germination process. So once it drinks a lot of water, then it's going to start to slow down because it's getting full. And then there's going to be the beginning of the digestion process. So first it's going to wake up the seedling. Once it wakes up the seedling, then the seedling is going to uh, release the enzymes that will break the endosperm and change the endosperm, whether it be from starch or oils to sugar. And that is why it's going to give the energy for the seedling to continue on with the germination process. And once the digestion takes place, now the seedling has energy to begin to grow and eventually get to the establishing phase. So these are the three phases that the seedling had to take place or had to go through in order for it to germinate and in order for it to come out of the soil and for you to be able to see it and admire it. So I mentioned there's a lot of things that had to happen, and all of this had to happen at the right time in the process, proper order for it to occur. So activation with water, that's why water is very important. That just activates the germination, digestion of that endosperm, and then the growth of the seedling and establishment. And then if we look at what happens, so phase one activation, imbibition meaning absorbing the water, the seed increase in volume, just water being taken, and then beginning of respiration because now the plant, the seedling is going to be more active, production of the enzymes, and then the beginning of the elongation to bring out the root. So that is what's happening when the plant begins to drink the water. Later in the digestion process, again, a lot of the protein for growth, the metabolism increases, the store energy, the enzyme begins to loosen and digest all of that. And then the food begins to move from the different areas where the plant is going to need it. And that's going to then begin to give the energy for the elongation of the cell and also the cell division that will then begin to increase the cell number and allow that stem to get thick, taller, bigger, and the plant begin to grow. So just a list of all the different things that are happening. So should you know the list? No, but know exactly what is happening so that next time you see you're successful in germinating a seed, know the intricate steps that happen. And so it's not just, oh, here's a seed, let's plant it, voila, we're done. And so This is just general information. I mentioned before, when you plant your seeds, make sure you don't bury them too deep. So here it says pseudo 3. I usually go 3 times the diameter or the thickness of the seed, because if you plant them very, very deep, the seed may not have enough endosperm to last for 3, 4, 5 days until the roots manage to penetrate to the surface. And so they may run out of food and the seed is going to starve, or the seed is going to starve. So planting them too deep can be a big problem, because there's only a certain amount of endosperm that the plant has. So that is why the bigger the seed, probably the more endosperm, the more energy it has, the deeper that you can plant them. The smaller the seeds, there's hardly anything. They need to be almost on the surface and they will germinate. And the moment they germinate, they already have the roots. The leaves are closer to the sunlight and or the light. And again, limited oxygen, that would be with, if you happen to put them in the ground, there's going to be less oxygen, which is going to prevent some of them from coming out of dormancy, some of the seeds. And so here's a recap. This is the seed that if you give it the right care, you give it the right environmental factors, you're going to have the radicle, which will turn into the root. You're going to have the cotyledon that will then become or be those kidney bean shaping things for beans, will have the energy reserve. And then you have the shoot or the hypocotyledon that will eventually become the stem with the true leaves for the plant. So that's what we are trying to achieve, taking a seed and making it grow into a big plant. And I think that's success right here. So that's the germination of those seeds. And that still needs to make some better chlorophyll. And I think that's the last of the slide. So any questions on this big, gigantic process? Again, it's very intricate, but it's happening. And it's happening in all of your trays. So any questions? Any questions from the audience in the computer?
Okay.
No, all right. So I'll stop the recording. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next time.
That's it.
All right, see you Tuesday. Bye.